So hello everyone. Yeah, just to echo that there, thanks very much for joining it and taking time out of your what I'm sure is very busy schedules to join this session, and I hope you find it really useful. So we've titled this session ADHD Spotting the Signs. So there might be various reasons as to why you've joined this session. I'm assuming from the kind of the content that we've put out there, for most people it may be that you maybe suspect that your child could possibly have ADHD. You're not 100% sure, and we're just looking for a little bit more insight into that. It could also be that your child does have already a diagnosis of ADHD, and you're just looking for a little bit more insight, a few more tips and ideas and things like that. So hopefully we can get a chance to cover all of that in the time that we've got. I'm going to leave some space at the end as well for any questions. If anyone wants to ask anything, please feel free to just let me know. I always say as well with GoToWebinar, if there's any issues around kind of sound or video or anything like that, the first port of call for me would just be to kind of leave and rejoin. Usually sorts most problems out, but do let us know if there's anything that's quite persistent. And as we've said, you will get a copy. This is being recorded. You will be able to access that recording as well. What I'm going to do as well is there's a few links that I've put into these slides here that might be useful for sort of further reading and further research and things like that. So I'm going to send on, I'll send them on to Witherslack a copy of the slides, and then those of you who've attended this session can access those slides, then we can forward them on to you. So I'll send them across. I've left my email address at the end, I think, so if you wanted to get in touch with me about anything, please feel free. So we'll get started anyway, just to kind of give you a little bit of an insight, I suppose, into my role here at the ADHD Foundation. If you've not attended any sessions that I've delivered before, my name's Arron. I work mainly as the, I'm the sort of fancy title, Director of Education Training, which is just a very fancy way of saying I do a lot of training around educating children with ADHD and autism, etc. I also do a lot of therapeutic work in schools with neurodivergent children as well. And on top of that, sort of prior to that, my role was I used to be a primary school teacher, and I worked in mainstream schools for a number of years before I kind of moved into this role here. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a background there so you know where I'm sort of coming from. In terms of what we're going to cover in this session today, we're going to firstly look a little bit of an understanding of what ADHD is, and that's going to be kind of the main focus of that title, really, spotting the signs. What do we need to be looking out for when it comes to ADHD? What could be a sign of ADHD? What would be a sign of sort of typical development as well? And how can we kind of spot the difference? We'll have a little look at that. Also looking at what ADHD isn't, because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about ADHD. We'll look at lots of other ways that ADHD can have an impact on an individual, and then as we go through, we're going to look at as many sort of support strategies and adjustments that we can make as possible. And the key thing there really is looking at these strategies and adjustments and things that we can do to support our child, whether or not they've got a diagnosis, because as you probably know, it can take an awfully long time to get that diagnosis. And I'm sure we probably know that already. And for anyone who wasn't aware of that, I do apologise to be the bearer of bad news, so to speak. But depending on where we live in the country, most areas, quite significant waiting lists really for an ADHD assessment. So the point of that really is when we look at support strategies and things that we can do to try and help. Lots of the stuff, in fact, probably all of it that I'm going to talk about today is things that we can do whether or not someone's got that diagnosis. So if we're waiting for a diagnosis or we suspect someone might have ADHD, we can still do an awful lot to try and help them in that time before they get that diagnosis. Okay, so in terms of what ADHD is, it's quite a big question really, and I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible. It's important to note that it's a neurodevelopmental condition, meaning that it's to do with how our brain develops, and it is a lifelong condition as well. It's not something that can be sort of trained out of someone or parented out of someone. It's certainly not caused by you know, lack of boundaries at home or anything like that. Which is kind of a bit of a misconception about ADHD, that it's somehow caused by poor parenting and bad parenting. I know I don't need to tell you this, but just to reaffirm and give you that confidence, it is absolutely not caused by that. It's a genetic condition. Now, when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean that if your child has ADHD, it doesn't necessarily mean that one of you as the parents could have ADHD as well. It could do, but not necessarily. Genetics don't always work in that way, and there's lots of different factors which can influence how our genetics present themselves. But that's the thing to note, is that it's caused by a genetic makeup. It's not caused by bad parenting or anything like that, which is a really old-fashioned myth that we've heard in the past. There are three main areas that we're going to look at in terms of getting a diagnosis for ADHD, and they are inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. So I'm going to talk through what they are and some signs to look out for. And then a couple of other little bits to maybe have a little eye on as well and look out for as well when it comes to ADHD. I wanted to start by talking about the positives of the condition as well, because despite the focus of the conversation around ADHD tending to be a lot on the negatives and the sort of deficits, if you like, there are a lot of strengths and a lot of positive traits that can come with ADHD too. And if your child does have ADHD or does show a lot of signs of ADHD, it's really important to know that this is not a bad thing, and it's going to cause a lot of challenges for them, of course, and we may be dealing with these challenges on a daily basis, but it's not inherently a bad thing, and there are a lot of positive traits that can come with ADHD as well. If we think about someone who's impulsive, for example, so they maybe find it difficult to think before they speak, think before they act. That can cause a lot of issues for them, of course, but actually if they're really quick on their feet, they're really spontaneous, in the right scenario, that can be a real advantage. So it's worth bearing in mind that all of the negatives that we associate with ADHD, we can also flip them around to positives if sort of channeled and harnessed in the right way. Someone who is hyperactive, we could see them as really energetic, really enthusiastic, especially when they're kind of engaged in something that they're interested in, and they can tap into what we call hyperfocus, which is almost where we see a child with ADHD who really maybe struggles to sustain their attention on tasks and topics that they don't enjoy, but when they're doing something that they're really into and it's their sort of particular interest, they can really pay attention and really hone in and tap into what we call hyperfocus, and that might be something that we recognize in some of our children as well. And then problem solving skills, creativity is often associated with ADHD as well. But I just wanted to start with that just to say that, you know, it's not inherently a bad thing. As you probably know already, there are a lot of positive traits that can come with ADHD, but we don't tend to focus on them quite a lot. So I just wanted to start with that just to kind of say that, you know, it's not necessarily a negative thing. And I've left some links a little bit later on that I'm going to signpost you to some of our resources that we've got on our website, and Witherslack have got loads on their website as well, free resources to access. We've got quite a lot around trying to celebrate the strengths of ADHD with your child if that's something you're interested in. So I'll kind of bring your attention to those a little bit later on in the session. In terms of some myths and misconceptions about ADHD, there are quite a lot. Firstly, there is this kind of misconception that ADHD or neurodiversity in general, so looking at other conditions there like autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, there's some misconception that it's somehow linked to IQ or somehow linked to intelligence. It's not, it's absolutely not, as you probably are well aware. I've taught many very bright children with ADHD in the past. There's no kind of link between your sort of neurotype, if you like, or the makeup of your brain and your intelligence. It can create barriers to learning, of course, in a school setting. If we've got someone who struggles with organisation, struggles with attention and things like that, it can get in the way of learning. But it doesn't mean that someone with ADHD inherently doesn't have the ability to learn. It just means that they might need a little bit of support in some areas to break down some of those barriers to learning. It doesn't affect more boys than girls either. So if you have a daughter who you suspect could have ADHD, you may have heard from people in the past, oh, well, it's mostly about boys. It's absolutely not, and I'm sure we're already aware of this. Just as many girls have ADHD as boys. However, there are many more boys diagnosed with ADHD than girls, and there's lots of reasons for that. Masking plays a huge part in that as well, and girls tend to mask more frequently than boys, generally speaking, of course, and there's always exceptions to that. But the diagnosis ratio is around 3 to 1 in favour of boys, and the adult, that's in childhood. The adult diagnosis ratio is around 2 to 1 in favor of men. And this doesn't mean that women develop ADHD when they get older. It means that they're probably being missed when they're younger, and there's lots of reasons for that. The main one being masking, really. I think also a lot of the research historically has been leaning towards males and leaning towards boys, so it's kind of informed this idea that it's somehow this condition that's all about boys, or this naughty boy syndrome, which is what it's been called in the past, which leads me on to my next point, really, is that ADHD is absolutely not a naughty child syndrome. This is a very old-fashioned idea. ADHD can lead a child to have a lot of issues with dysregulation. So it might be that they're really emotionally dysregulated and they're really impulsive as well, which is maybe not a great mix all the time in certain scenarios, but it's not inherently this naughty child syndrome. The other thing to mention as well is that there will be lots of children with ADHD who won't have any issues with behaviour in school, and or won't have many kind of issues with dysregulation in school outwardly. And if we continue to see it as this sort of naughty child syndrome, they're going to continue to get missed. It's not overdiagnosed either. And there's this myth at the moment. There's a lot of talk around the overdiagnosis of ADHD. There's no evidence to support that idea. There's no evidence to suggest that there actually is an overdiagnosis of ADHD. What the evidence does suggest is that we've got perhaps now, because we've certainly seen an increase in diagnosis, certainly in recent times. The evidence, however, suggests that this is more of an accurate diagnosis than we've had in the past. And it's not that we're now overdiagnosing people with ADHD, it's that historically we've been underdiagnosing the condition and we're now diagnosing it more. And people often talk about, well, more people are getting diagnosed because we're talking about it more. And of course, that's absolutely the case. It's not that we're creating this condition by talking about it more, it's that we're drawing our attention to it more. I always like to see it as if anyone drives and you're kind of in the market for a new car and there's a certain make and model that you're interested in, all of a sudden you'll start seeing that car everywhere when you're driving around. And what it doesn't mean, of course, it doesn't mean that everyone's bought that car at the same time. It means that your attention is drawn to it. And it's the same, in my opinion, for ADHD. It's always been there. There's documents describing conditions like ADHD from well over 100 years ago. It's always been there. We just now know a lot more about it and we're understanding it a lot more. So we're picking up on it and we're spotting it, like that kind of metaphor of the car, really. It's not something that's over medicated either. And I've had people say to me in the past that ADHD is kind of an excuse for parents to get the kids on pills to make them behave, and that's absolutely not true, as you well know. And anyone who has any experience of ADHD medication will know that's absolutely not how the medication works. I can't go into loads of detail on medication just because I'm not qualified to kind of give advice on medication. If anyone does have any questions about it, please feel free to ask them, and I'd just be honest and let you know if it's something that I could or couldn't answer. But if I can't answer it, I can kind of direct you to the right place. But if your child is on the pathway and is going through the process of a diagnosis, or you're thinking about that, the conversation about medication is likely to come up if they get diagnosed with ADHD, and you may well be offered medication for your child. We've got lots of advice on our website around ADHD medication, so I'm going to signpost you to that later on, because it can be quite a scary thing, and there's a lot of negative press out there about ADHD medication, and it's the thing to note is it's not this big scary thing that sometimes people suggest it is. But of course, it's all about the individual, and it may or may not be right for your child, and it's just about speaking to those professionals and speaking to the pediatrician and having that honest conversation. But as I say, a little bit later on, I've put in some information on that to signpost you to if you're interested in having a little look at some more info on medication. But I actually think one of the biggest misconceptions comes from the name itself. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now disorder for me, we think about ASD and autism spectrum disorder as well. I think it's very negative language, and I think it just implies that there's maybe something wrong with someone or that there's some sort of error. I would wholeheartedly disagree with that, and there is not anything wrong with someone who's got ADHD. There's not anything wrong with someone who's autistic. It's just a difference. So it's more of a, I would probably use the word condition instead of disorder. Just means that someone's brain works a little bit differently. And attention deficit as well. I'm personally not sure if that's very accurate or fit for purpose, really. So just being kind of open and honest, really, I've got ADHD myself. I was diagnosed in adulthood, so I was about 26, 27 when I got diagnosed. I would argue, for me personally, it's not an attention deficit. So for me, I think attention deficit implies like something's missing there. You're kind of lacking attention, so you can't pay attention. You don't have a kind of a good attention span. For me, I would say it's probably the opposite, and I feel like I pay attention to absolutely everything. And what I have a challenge with is regulating that, so filtering out the things that I don't need to pay attention to and being able to focus in then on the things that are important, I do need to pay attention to. So this might be a more accurate description of the condition rather than that attention deficit. And another good description is from someone called Dr. Ned Hallowell, who describes his ADHD brain as having a Ferrari engine, but with bicycle brakes. So there's so much potential there, it can go so quick, there's so much good that can happen because of that, the makeup of that brain. The challenge he's got is that he's got this set of bicycle brakes to kind of manage and control it, so it can be difficult for him to kind of get things under control and harness things there. The other thing to kind of note when we're thinking about ADHD in the brain is the relationship between dopamine and ADHD. So you've probably heard of dopamine before. Dopamine plays a vital role in our reward system. So it's what gives us our sense of reward. So when we're seeking out that sense of reward, so we might post a photograph on social media and we get likes and we feel that sense of reward then, that's kind of dopamine in action. Dopamine also helps us with rewarding ourselves for completing tasks and getting things done. So if you tick something off a to-do list, you might feel quite good about yourself, and that's dopamine in action. That's you sort of rewarding yourself and you ticking it off, and your brain giving you that sense of reward for completing that task. Now, dopamine has a bit of a complicated relationship with ADHD, and generally speaking, there's thought to be a deficiency of dopamine in the ADHD brain. And what this can lead to is a lot of children with ADHD, and adults as well, who seem to be seeking that sense of reward all the time, or seeking stimulation all the time. So they might really struggle to pay attention to one thing because they need that sense of reward. They need that stimulation from multiple things. It could sometimes present itself as someone who does something in the moment because they get that short-term reward, but they're not thinking through the long-term consequences of that. We might also see someone with ADHD who doesn't seem motivated by the same kind of things as a child without ADHD, for example. So dopamine and ADHD is something to consider there as well as we go through, and that lack of dopamine or that deficiency of dopamine can lead to someone who's seeking stimulation all the time. Okay, so in terms of the diagnostic criteria and sort of things to sort of look out for, there are two categories on the diagnostic criteria, and the first one is called inattention. So a few ideas here as to what we can see on the diagnostic criteria of what we're looking out for, really. The first thing that I'll say is that I taught in a primary school for about 5 years, and I think if I looked at this list for long enough, I'd probably diagnose every child I've ever taught with ADHD, because of course all kids do these things, all adults do these things as well. The difference when it comes to ADHD is the significance of that. So of course there's no suggestion that someone without ADHD doesn't lose things, doesn't make careless mistakes, doesn't forget things. For someone with ADHD, they're likely doing that much more consistently, and it's having much more of a significant impact on them in comparison to their peers without ADHD. So I'll go through them and then I'm going to explain the diagnostic process a little bit for you. So we've got inattention here, so I'll go through them as quick as I can. So someone who consistently, again, maybe fails to give close attention to details. I will say as well, some of the language here, this is just pulled directly from the diagnostic criteria. Some of the language is quite negative. but it's just pulled word for word from that criteria there. So fails to give close attention to details, has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or activities. So we might have someone who they can pay attention to things, but it's about holding their attention for extended periods of time. They might not seem to listen when spoken to, they might drift off when we're talking to them, consistently failing to follow instructions, trouble organising tasks, avoids tasks that require sustained mental effort. So they might, anything that we know is going to take a lot of attention and a lot of kind of focus, they might actively avoid some tasks like that. Forgetfulness, forgetting things which are needed to complete a task, making, or not even a task, you know, forgetting things like, I can think back to when I was at school and I'd be at the gate with, get to the gate with my mum every day, and we'd have to march straight back up and go to the lost property because I'd lost my 7th jumper that week, and something like that that's happening consistently. Again, doesn't necessarily mean ADHD, but could be a sign. Making careless mistakes, or mistakes that we know that they can avoid, but consistently making those mistakes in written work, losing things again, and then forgetfulness as well, and issues around memory. So that would be inattention. The other category is called hyperactivity and impulsivity. Now, that's actually one category on the diagnostic criteria. On these slides here, I've just split it up into 2 separate slides, just in terms of being able to go into a little bit more depth, but it's worth bearing in mind that there's only 2 categories on the criteria itself. So the first part of the second category is hyperactivity. So we might have someone who struggles with sitting still, for example, so fidgeting with their hands or feet, squirming in their seat. They might be up out of the seat all the time in a classroom setting, for example, running or climbing when it's not appropriate, and no matter how many reminders we give them, they never seem to kind of learn from that, for want of a better phrase, is that it just keeps happening all the time. It could be a sign that it's maybe something that's they're finding it difficult to control. They might feel restless quite a lot, might really struggle to work or play quietly. They might just seem to be on the go all the time, driven by a motor, those children who just need something to do constantly. And then excessive talk as well, and verbal hyperactivity can also be a sign. Then we've got impulsivity. So this might be someone in a classroom setting who shouts out answers all the time, or just in outside of the classroom, someone who struggles to wait their turn. So when we're talking to them at home, they might interrupt us in conversations all the time, or they might interrupt their siblings in conversations all the time, or they might struggle with turn taking in games, and they might appear really impatient, or seeming to act without thinking. And those children, I can think of so many children that I used to teach who something had happened, they do something, and when we'd be talking about it, reflecting on it, and we'd ask why did you do that, what kind of went through your head at that moment in time, and usually the answer would be I don't know, and they genuinely didn't know why they'd done something. And if that's happening consistently, that could be a sign that someone's quite impulsive, so they're acting before they've even thought. Again, interrupting, as we've mentioned already, risk-taking behaviour we might see as part of impulsivity too. So that leaves us with 3 main sort of types, if you like, of ADHD. So we've got predominantly hyperactive impulsive type. Now this is someone who, so for a child, so for someone 17 and under, the diagnostic criteria, as I said, we've got one category, which is this here, that's one category, and then we've got a second category here around inattention. So for someone to be diagnosed with hyperactive impulsive type, they would show 6 or more characteristics from that hyperactive impulsive category and less than 6 from the inattentive category. Now that is for someone 17 or under. 18 and over, it would be 5 characteristics there that we'd be looking at for an adult diagnosis. But when we're talking about childhood, it's 6 characteristics. Now the key with the diagnostic criteria is it's 6 of those traits that we believe are having a significant impact on them, and we think it's possibly more significant than what would be typical for that stage of their development. So essentially, compared to their peers, compared to those in the classroom, or the majority of those in the classroom, or compared to their siblings maybe when they were that age, if they're not showing the same characteristics, we're noticing a significant difference. And the tricky thing, but one of the key things of a diagnosis, is being able to show those that they present with those characteristics across more than one setting. Now this can be a real issue when it comes to masking, and when it comes to someone who maybe doesn't show those characteristics in school but we see it at home. If anyone's got any questions around that and how we can kind of deal with that in terms of a diagnosis, please feel free to ask anything like that, and we can talk about that at the end as well. And the other thing to bear in mind is you wouldn't get a diagnosis of it, depending on the age of your child that we've come onto this call for today. You wouldn't get a diagnosis of ADHD until after the age of 6. And the reason why is because it can be a little bit more difficult in those early stages of development. It can be a little bit more difficult to differentiate between possible ADHD and sort of signs of just typical brain development and typical childhood development. So we might absolutely notice differences in those early years in comparison to their peers, and it's just in that stage, the only thing that we can do really, and the best thing that we can do, is just have a clear communication with their reception teacher, with the nursery practitioners, wherever they are, and just keep as many observations, as many notes as possible, so when they are old enough to get a diagnosis, that's more evidence that we can take with us. So they're unlikely to get a diagnosis in those early years. Usually we're looking at about 6 and over to get that diagnosis, just for those reasons, but I just thought I'd mention that. And then we've got predominantly inattentive type as well. So this would be someone who shows 6 or more of those inattention symptoms and less than 6 of the hyperactive impulsive ones. And this is the one that can get missed quite a lot because it doesn't really fit in with the stereotypes of ADHD. A lot of stereotypes of ADHD are about physical hyperactivity, about kind of that kind of need to move all the time and impulsiveness and so on, and that inattentive side can be a little bit more subtle. This is also known as ADD, attention deficit disorder, as well, just not to get confused. We're talking about the same thing there. And then we've got combined type 2, which would be 6 or more across both of those inattentive and hyperactive impulsive categories. So feel free to use these slides here as kind of almost like a tick list, I suppose, and kind of have a little think through when you receive a copy of these. And we've got lots of information on our website that can help with that as well. Okay, I'm just going to play you this quick video just to kind of talk a little bit about hyperactivity as well, and help us to kind of understand it a little bit more too. So we've got the same child here on 2 different days, and he's been asked to watch a 10-minute video on both clips here. So on the left, he's watching a 10-minute instructional maths video, and on the right, he's watching a 10-minute clip from a Star Wars film. So I'm just going to play them both side by side and maybe see if you can recognize any of your children in this. Okay, so we can see a very kind of clearly different picture on both sides there, in that he's constantly moving on the left, swings around quite a lot. He doesn't really move too much on the right. He does fidget a little bit, but he's pretty much sat still. They then sort of questioned him and quizzed him on both videos, and he was able to recall all of the information from both. So he had clearly focused and paid attention on both sides. The difference for him is that because he was interested in what he was watching on the right, he didn't need to move as much to feel stimulated. He was already rewarded. He was already getting that dopamine transmission, because he was watching something that he was interested in. So he already felt stimulated. On the left, he wasn't stimulated by the content, so he needed to move in order to focus and pay attention. And this is something that I'm saying to teachers all the time, is that children with ADHD, like this person on the left here, they're not necessarily moving because they're trying to distract themselves. It's usually the opposite. They're moving a lot of the time to try and stimulate themselves and help them to focus. So I thought I'd show that in case it's something that we can recognize as well. Now, on these slides here, I've left lots of, the plan was never to kind of go through every single kind of point on all of these, but I've put them together because I was aware I was going to send them out as a bit of a kind of reference point as well. So if we've got time, we're going to come back to a couple of these ideas here around supporting that need for hyperactivity, impulse control, focus and attention as well. I just wanted to touch on something else. So we will come back to a little bit of this, but It's on the slides there in terms of just some general tips there to start with for when I send them out. But I wanted to talk about this area as well. So something that we call executive functioning. So this is a set of skills that we all use on a daily basis, and they operate from this part of your brain here. It's called your prefrontal cortex. It sits at the front of your brain, and it's the last part of your brain to develop. Now, in ADHD, we can see from brain scans structural differences of that prefrontal cortex. So it's likely that someone with ADHD will have more significant challenges with the skills that operate from there than children without ADHD, for example. So there's no suggestion that a child without ADHD won't have any kind of issues with the skills that operate from there, but for someone with, we're likely to see more significant challenges. So there are 8 skills, so I'll go through them as quickly as I can. So we've got impulse control, emotional control, flexible thinking, so being able to adapt to unexpected changes, working memory, that's a short-term memory, so our ability to store information in the short term that we have to use. So essentially, if we give our child a lot of verbal instructions, the better their working memory is, the more of those instructions they could take on. The sort of poorer their working memory is, for example, the fewer of those instructions they could take on. Self-monitoring, knowing how well you're doing at something, knowing how you're coming across, being able to monitor yourself against the clock and manage your time effectively as well. Planning and prioritizing, task initiation, so just getting started on things, and then organization, to keeping track of things physically, keeping track of things mentally. So in terms of other signs to look out for, now this isn't something that's necessarily on the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, because it's not exclusive to ADHD. But when we're looking at whether our child possibly could have ADHD, if they have executive functioning difficulties, it could be another sign, another thing to look out for as well. There's lots of stuff that we can do to try and help and support someone with executive functioning difficulties. A lot of technology that we can use. I've picked out a few kind of organizational apps and things like that there that can be really helpful. Using digital timers can be really helpful too. So for someone to see that physical passing of time, I've recommended one there called 360 Thinking, which I like to use as a kind of a tool for if we're kind of trying to give them structure at home and we're trying to say, right, we can have 20 minutes doing this, but then we've got to do this for 10 minutes and so on. I usually have a screenshot of that there, but I've missed it off. Basically, it gives us an analog clock, and we can chunk up the clock into different segments and assign colors to each one. So you might have a 10-minute green chunk, a 10-minute red chunk, a 10-minute yellow chunk, for example. And it doesn't mean that they have to tell the time on an analog clock to be able to use it. It's about them being able to see that physical passing of time, so they can see, okay, the time's ticking, I'm on the green, I've got that amount of green left, and they can just watch that time go, so it can really help. Another one that I'd recommend as well, I've left a link to this one here, is called Brilli Routines, and this is a sort of a visual timetable, a kind of routine planner designed for parents of children with ADHD. So what it lets you do is you download it on your device, and you can set up sort of the routine for the evening, and then you kind of have like the master account, if you like, and it's linked to your child's account on their device, and then it pings the routine through to them. So when we're trying to have that consistency and we're trying to say, well, this is what we're doing this evening, we've got an hour on this, half an hour for this, half an hour for this, and so on, you can set it up on your phone and ping it through to their device, and then they can have it there in front of them, and it will have all timers for each thing. So it's a really kind of, for me, I find it a really easy and simple way to try and build in some of those routines at home as well. And so that's one that I would recommend there. None of the kind of apps or technology that I mentioned, we're not sponsored by any of them. They're just kind of ones that I've used and have found quite useful. So just one that I'd recommend there, but there's lots of examples of things like this out there, and I've picked a few out on the slide there as well, just to help someone with some of these skills at home and things that we can do too. Another skill there is around impulse control as well, and things that we can do to try and support that. So for someone who is quite impulsive, and again, there's no suggestion that all of the tips are for everyone. There's going to be no one size fits all approach, but for someone who's quite verbally impulsive, where writing isn't an issue, using that writing as an opportunity to channel that impulse elsewhere. So using a notebook, for example, so trying to get into the habit of, when you are if we could say, you know, if I'm talking to someone or if I'm talking to you, but you've got something to say, instead of interrupting me, just write it down there or draw a symbol or do something that's going to remind you, and then we can talk about it later on, and trying to give them the opportunities to channel that impulse elsewhere. Things like resistance bands and stress balls can be helpful for some of that physical impulsivity as well, and I'll come back to that shortly. And then I also like to use games as an opportunity to practice impulse control as well. Because if we think about it, if your child is quite impulsive, the only opportunity they have to really practice those skills of impulse control is in those situations where it matters, where emotions are running high. So it might be with their friends, it might be with their siblings, it might be with us as parents. But if they're really impulsive, when emotions are running high, they're probably not going to succeed in controlling their impulses a lot of the time. So we can use games as an opportunity to allow them to practice that skill in a more friendly, sort of light-hearted setting, if you like. Using Jenga as an example, so if we touch a block, you have to take that block out. So we establish that rule early on, and then it's about the conversation of how can you stop yourself from diving in and rushing into it, and is there anything that you can do? Is it squeeze the stress ball? Do you want to tap 3 times on your chest? Do you want to tap 3 times on the table? How are you going to stop yourself diving into that situation? Snap's a good one to do it with as well. So I often play like a points-based version. So if you snap at the wrong time, which someone who's impulsive is likely to do, then you kind of lose points and there's some sort of penalty there, because then it just allows us to have that conversation around how are we going to stop you snapping at that time. So again, it might be, okay, if you feel like you need to, make sure you've got that stress ball in your hand, give that a squeeze and give yourself some time to kind of process and think about what you're about to do. In terms of another area that can affect a lot of children and young people and adults with ADHD as well, sleep is quite a big topic, really. Many with ADHD can have issues with sleep. Lots of reasons for that. Some statistics there around sleep and ADHD, but generally speaking, we might see a lot of children with ADHD who are having difficulties with their sleep. So again, if we're thinking that our child possibly could have ADHD, this isn't a defining characteristic. So if your child, you firmly believe that they have ADHD, but they don't have any issues with sleep, that's fine. That doesn't mean that they don't have ADHD. But if we're looking for signs and we're thinking, I'm not sure, just another thing to consider is that around half of children and young people with ADHD report to struggle to fall asleep by the age of 12. So it might be something to consider as well. I've left on here lots of kind of sleep tips, and I'm going to signpost you to a lot more a little bit later on. One thing to mention is around kind of screen time as well, and the blue light exposure from looking at our screens. And if we're guilty of this as adults as well, and I do it, but if you are sat on your phone or sat on your iPad in bed and then you try and sleep straight away, the light that's emitted and your eyes are exposed to is less. Research has shown that you are less likely to be able to fall asleep because of that. And actually, the best practice is screens off an hour before bed. Now, I'm fully aware that this is a lot easier said than done, and we as adults struggle to do this a lot of the time. So getting a child or a teenager to do this is even more difficult, but just something that I thought I'd mention. Sleep diaries can help as well in terms of trying to keep track and notice trends and patterns, and I've left a link on there to a free version of a sleep diary that you can find online. So when you get a copy of these slides, please feel free to have a look at that as well. Diet and ADHD too, and if we have a little bit more time, I'll come back to that. But one thing I wanted to mention was around emotional regulation and ADHD, because we might see a lot of children with ADHD who seem to really struggle to manage and control their emotions. And it's because of how the ADHD brain works, really. So we've got 2 parts of our brain here that are described by Dr. Steve Peters in this book. He talks about our human brain and our chimp brain. So our human brain is actually called our frontal lobe, and our chimp brain is actually called our limbic system. Now, when we're operating from that human brain, that's when we're sort of calm and thinking logically and thinking rationally, and we're able to kind of reason, and that's when we feel very regulated. The limbic system houses our amygdala, which is our alarm center that triggers our fight, flight, or freeze response. So when we sense danger, we get put on high alert because we're trying to protect ourselves. Our brain is trying to protect us from that perceived danger there. Now, that can be a good thing when we are actually in danger, and if you need to get out of the way of a moving train or something like that, then it's helpful to kind of feel that panic, because that's going to get you out of the way that as quickly as possible. The issue is when we're operating from that limbic system when there is And we're likely to see this more in children with ADHD because that prefrontal cortex, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex has a disrupted development, meaning that this emotional side of our brain can take over quite a lot. And that's the important thing to remember, is that when a child is operating from this part of their brain, they're not going to be able to think logically or rationally or reason. It's going to be very difficult to do that, and I'm sure we've all been in that situation before. On top of that, there's something that's often associated with ADHD called rejection sensitive dysphoria, with an extreme sensitivity to rejection, and they might feel like they're being pushed out and persecuted and left out all the time, and they might just really not be noticing any signs that show that that's not true, and they might really focus in on signs that maybe point to the fact that they could be being pushed out, and this is something that's very commonly associated with ADHD as well. So another reason why we might see a lot of issues around emotional regulation too. And I think the important thing to consider is this emotional curve here. So when we're at the bottom here, that's when we're calm and we're thinking rationally. So if we go back to the chimp brain, human brain, here we're operating from the human brain. And then there'll always be some sort of trigger, and they're not always easy to spot. But when we get to this point here, that's when we're starting to not think rationally anymore. But we can calm ourselves down and come back down. Sometimes that's not going to work, and we're going to get to this top point here, that complete breakdown, that complete loss of rational thinking. So we're operating purely from that chimp brain there. So the important thing to remember is, as I've pointed out on the slide there, you're not able to think rationally or logically. So we've probably all been in situations where we're trying to reason with our child in that moment in time, and they're just not able to reason at all. And it's because they're operating from that very emotional part of their brain, and they might do or say things that they go on to regret later on, but it's just almost like a defense at that moment in time. And we'll have been in that situation as adults as well, of course, on many occasions. We will eventually recover and start to feel calm and think rationally again. Now, when someone is up here, in theory, the best thing that we can do is allow them the space to be up there and not try and sort of reason with someone who's not able to reason. We might want to talk about consequences and things, but it's usually better if we can wait until they're calm again to reflect on things and talk about consequences. Now, it's when I say kind of allow them the space to be up there, in practice, it's not always as easy as that. You know, when safety is a concern and when we're out in public and things, it can be really, really challenging, of course. I fully recognize that. But just to kind of explain, in theory, if we're trying to reason with someone who's here and operating from that chimp brain, we're very unlikely to succeed, and it might be better to kind of wait it out if there's an opportunity to do that, and then reflect and kind of talk at the situation when they do feel rational and calm again. Now, one thing that I like to try and do, because obviously that's if we get to this point, but ideally we can get to this point and then sort of calm ourselves back down and bring ourselves back down. I like to use a template like this to try and do that. So before we even start looking at how can you calm yourself down, what things can you use to calm yourself down, I like to use a template like this. So what we're essentially trying to do is think about exactly where in your body you feel that emotion. So if your child feels angry quite a lot, or your child feels anxious quite a lot, trying to get them to understand exactly what that physical response is for them. So we might say, right, well, when you feel angry, where exactly in your body do you feel it? And they might talk about feeling butterflies in the stomach, or they might talk about feeling like a tightness of the chest, or sweaty palms, or a headache, or whatever it feels like for them physically. And then once we've named it, there's a phrase that sometimes I'll use where we'll say, like, name it and then tame it, but we have to be able to name it first. So right, that's the butterflies in the stomach, that's the headache, that's the tightness of the chest. We can't start to tame that feeling until we've actually recognized it and named it. And then once we can recognize that, we can see it as a warning sign that we need to try and calm ourselves down. So we might use some relaxation techniques. So take 5 breathings, quite a nice one, where you take your hand like that and you trace round, and as you go up, you breathe in through your nose. As you go down, you breathe out through your mouth, and you can repeat as many times as you want. Grounding techniques can be helpful sometimes as well. So weighted resources, stress balls, resistance bands, couple of distraction techniques at the bottom here as well. Count the colors is one that I'll often try and use. So before someone's lost control, I'll say, right, quick, pick a color. And let's say they say green. I'll say, tell me all the green things that you can see in this room. They name them all. And I'll say, close your eyes, think as many green things as you can, and they just have to name them out loud. And all we're really trying to do is just force them to think about something else and just help them to try and focus on something else. I'll come back to that one. Sorry, these are the right order. And then here as a resource that I would recommend with lots of these little tips and ideas on, something called Cards Against Anxiety, which is nothing like Cards Against Humanity, if anyone's ever played that before. But it's a little deck of cards with loads of little coping strategies on for managing and regulating our emotions. If you Google, you can buy and PDF, but if you Google Cards Against Anxiety and then accidentally put the word PDF in before you press enter, so Cards Against Anxiety PDF, and then press enter, you'll find a school who've scanned and uploaded these to their website, so you can download them from there. Just something worth kind of having a lot of other ideas. I've also left a link on here to Elsa's free resources. So when we're trying to reflect on things and when we're trying to kind of have a little think about how we can kind of go back and reflect on events and possibly talk about how can we stop this happening in the future, loads of free resources on this link here to try and help us with some of those conversations. This is one that I like to use called the Circle of Control, where we talk about what's in our control, what's out of our control, what can we do about this, how can we try and let some of that stuff that's out of our control go. But there's loads of examples on that link there as well. As I mentioned too, there are a lot of resources that you can access on these links here from our website, with loads of ideas around supporting ADHD at home, more information on kind of the main topic of today's presentation, spotting the signs and so on. Lots of links there for you as well. And just to finish, as I said earlier, it's not a bad thing, it's not a negative thing if your child has ADHD. There are so many positives and so many kind of examples of very successful people living with ADHD, who a lot of these people attribute their success to their ADHD. And it's not that they've been so successful in spite of having ADHD, it's because of it. And it's actually the positive traits that have enabled them to be as successful as they have. So thank you very much. I hope you found it useful, and I hope there's some stuff that we can take away. As I say, it was never the plan to go through every single point on the slides in terms of all the strategies and things, just in terms of the time we've had, but I've left them all on there, so there is a bit of a reference point for you when you receive a copy of these. But we've got a bit of time. I've left a bit of time now, for more than happy to answer as many questions as possible. So excuse me, thank you very much for joining. If you did need to leave at this point, thanks so much, I appreciate it. But as I say, please feel free, if you haven't already, to ask any questions, and we'll try and go through as many questions as possible now. Okay, so if you just bear with me a second, I can't see the questions just yet. I know that people have asked some, so it might be that Camilla needs to come on and kind of, because maybe she can see the questions and I can't. So if you just give us a second, we can get the questions sorted. But in the meantime, please feel free to still ask any that might come through, that might come into your head, sorry. Okay, what I'll do while we're waiting anyway, because I think it might just be that Camilla needs to load up the questions for me, so I've just sent her a quick message. So while we're waiting anyway, I'm just going to go through a couple of the points here on some of these resources that I mentioned, because I kind of glossed over them a little bit. So just to make you aware of what some of these things are. So we've got our ADHD for Parents booklet, which is going to be a lot of the information I've presented today. But if you wanted to kind of have that as something to take away, please feel free to click on that link there. And it will give you it will give you all of that information there, as well as we have like a bit of a tick list in there. So if you're thinking about possibly maybe doing a bit of a self-assessment at home for your child and ticking things that you think they could have ADHD, they might not, you can kind of tick along on that list there. We also have these two booklets here, one aimed at teenagers, one aimed at children. Now these are designed for if your child does get a diagnosis of ADHD and you wanted to explain that to them and we're not really sure how, and you wanted to kind of talk about exactly what that means, what is the condition, how can they understand it a little bit better, I would absolutely recommend these two booklets here to help with that. We also have our Umbrella Gang comics here, which you can get free here from these links, which is another way of kind of having a conversation with your child about neurodiversity. So all of our characters here all have different conditions, and it's just more of a subtle way of explaining to your child around how, you know, different brains might work and so on. So if we wanted to kind of have that conversation about difference, that might be another opportunity to do that there as well. So I've left those on the slides for you. When you get them, you should just be able to click on any of those links and they'll come straight through for you. So Camilla, if you are there, would you be able to get the questions up for me, because I can't actually see them unless there's something that I'm doing wrong. So for everyone waiting, I do appreciate your patience, but we'll try and get to as many as possible.
Hi Arron. Thank you so much, that was brilliant. Yeah, well, like Arron says, we'll get through as many questions as possible. I know we've had so many in, so yeah, the first one, well, we've had quite a lot of questions about masking in school, and people saying that at home they show the signs quite a lot, but you know, in school they're masking it. They can be academically do well, or their behaviour's fine, and school aren't really supporting it. Is there anything they can do to?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. The first thing to say is I haven't got a really kind of positive answer for you, in that there's no kind of fix to that. The system that we're in, unfortunately, is not very helpful towards masking, in that you do have to show those characteristics across more than one setting. I would always just advise, and I'm sure something that we're already doing, being as open as possible with the school and having that communication and talking about masking. Feel free to use some of our resources here to help with that, because we do talk about masking and talk about girls quite a lot in relation to that as well, when we are having those conversations with the school. And you know, making notes of things at home, and showing, look, this is what's happening consistently. And I know we might have had negative experiences of feeling supported with school. I know a lot of teachers who would really want to help as well in that situation. So just being as open, as honest as possible, which I'm sure we are already doing. The other kind of thing around masking as well is that a lot of parents that I've worked with whose child is masking, they seem to have a little bit more success with a diagnosis through the private route. Now, the big kind of sort of con, if you like, the big kind of, if there's lots of pros to the private route, the big sort of con would be the cost, as in it can be very, very expensive. So but just to make you aware, if it is something you were exploring, what tends to happen is a lot of private clinics can use their initial assessment as one setting and home as another setting, if that makes sense. So even if they're not showing those characteristics in school, I've worked with a lot of parents who've had more success with a diagnosis through the private route when they through the private route when they are masking, because of that. The sort of headline is, I suppose, is it's really difficult, and I think things are going to have to change in terms of the diagnostic criteria. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. I'm not sure if that's a current priority of the powers that be at the moment. Things are going to have to change in terms of the way we assess ADHD and autism in terms of masking. But yeah, just to make you aware, private route, which you know, has its advantages and disadvantages, main one probably being the cost. I've worked with a lot of parents who've had a bit more success there, but as I say, feel free to use any of the resources we've got. when having conversations with the school around masking as well. And I'd just say write as many things down as possible, collect as much evidence as possible, just to try and support you. So when we are trying to, if things are going on at home, make a note of them. You might want to keep like a little diary necessarily. You might want to keep a little diary or something like that, but making a note and keeping as much evidence as possible to try and help us with our kind of with that process, if you like.
Amazing, thank you. Would you be able to quickly talk about ADHD and diet? We suspect my daughter may have ADHD, currently waiting for assessment, but she seems to be getting more and more picky about food. I hadn't considered this to be related.
Yeah, absolutely, it can be. And yeah, apologies because I skipped over that a little bit, just in terms I'd noticed the time was running out. Hopefully the information that I've put on the slides there will be really useful when you get them, but just to kind of give you a bit of an overview, yeah, diet and ADHD, it can absolutely be related. So sometimes we might have a child with ADHD who's quite an impulsive eater, or they might really gravitate towards sugary foods and things like that, again because of that need for stimulation and that need for dopamine. Processed foods and sugary foods, excuse me, can provide that dopamine, can provide that stimulation. So for someone who needs that and is lacking that in their brain, they might gravitate towards food like that a little bit more. Also, sensory differences linked to ADHD and sort of picky eating and fussy eating as well. And it's something for me. So again, I'll just be honest, I'm 30 years old now and I'm still and this isn't to kind of give you the bad news, and this is just me, and I know a lot of people it improves. I'm still as picky and as fussy as I was when I was a child, and I've always had a lot of issues around food and certain textures and certain smells and tastes and things like that. So it absolutely can be linked. Couple of bits of advice I would say is when we're trying to, our parents booklet has got lots of tips on diet in there as well, so I'd definitely have a look at that. When we're trying to introduce new sort of textures and tastes and things, something that you're probably already doing, but just trying to introduce them as gradually as possible, and not kind of trying to rush into things and force them to eat certain things. Obviously we want them to eat something, but often when it becomes that no, you have to eat this, and we kind of go down that route, I've seen more failures than successes, and experienced more failures than successes in my personal experience as well. But yeah, and to answer your question, they could absolutely be linked, and I would suspect probably are linked, to be honest with you. And then yeah, our parents guide here has got lots of information about diet and ADHD, and hopefully when you get those slides, they make sense with the information I've put on there as well.
Amazing, thank you. So my 12-year-old daughter is waiting assessment for ADHD. Her behavioural presentation has gone rapidly downhill since starting secondary school. She is spending time with her antisocial peer group, most of whom are children looked after, wondering about the rejection element you mentioned. She's become verbally and physically aggressive, truants frequently, and numerous suspensions. Would you say this is in line with an ADHD diagnosis?
I think the sort of the simple answer would be, I think a lot of the sort of presentations of ADHD and a lot of the kind of, as we said it earlier, it's not kind of inherently about behavior, but I think when we think about things like you've mentioned there, like rejection sensitivity, and things like kind of aggression sometimes in terms of verbal impulsivity, physical impulsivity as well. I think it probably would align with a lot of traits of ADHD, and it might be something worth looking at. Absolutely, if it's a concern, I would say absolutely kind of consider and have a look. And our parents booklet might be a bit of a starting point there, and hopefully if it is something that does kind of get diagnosed for her, I think in terms of her understanding herself, hopefully some of that stuff can start to, when she starts to understand her own brain a little bit better, and using some of our booklets and our teenagers guide to help with that and things like that too, when she does start to understand her own brain a little bit better, she can start to perhaps make more informed decisions and be able to calm herself down when she needs to, and she might decide that there's certain friends that she values more than others in terms of influence and stuff like that. So I would say, yeah, kind of, it's a bit, I suppose it's a bit more complicated than yes, it's definitely ADHD, but I think a lot of the presentations that we kind of discuss around ADHD would probably align with a lot of the challenges you're seeing, and I think you've picked up on that kind of rejection sensitivity there, as well as possibly a big factor there too. So yeah, it's definitely something I'd explore if I were you. And I think that's the thing sometimes, is people aren't sure whether to start looking at it or not. I always think it's worth exploring, either to rule it in or rule it out, and then at least we kind of know the answer then, and at least we kind of know what it is and we can move forward. So for anyone, if you have any suspicions, any concerns, I always think it's worth exploring. Doesn't mean that you have to definitely go down the route of a diagnosis if that's not something you wanted to do, but I think starting to look up information on ADHD and starting to kind of explore it is something I would recommend.
Great. We've had quite a few questions about how common is it to have autism and ADHD, or dyslexia and ADHD.
Very, very common is what I'd say there. So we call that co-occurrence, or sometimes it's called comorbidity. Now, most people have only got one diagnosis. The research suggests, however, that co-occurrence is the rule, not the exception. So the vast majority of people with one condition that would fall under that umbrella of neurodiversity, so ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on, the research suggests that the vast majority of people with one of those conditions are likely to have another one as well. So if you do have a child who already has a diagnosis of autism, or already has a diagnosis of dyslexia, and you suspect it could be ADHD, sometimes you might be put off and think, oh, well, no, it must be the dyslexia, it must be the autism. It's actually more common than not to have more than one condition. So yeah, I would say don't let a pre-existing diagnosis maybe put you off exploring ADHD as well, because the likelihood is, statistically, that they're probably going to have at least traits of more than one condition.
Great. And just one more question, because I know we've run out of time, but are some really struggles with unplanned changes occur? He gets very angry and upset, and it's very difficult to win him back around. Any suggestions on how we can support this?
Yeah, and that's something that kind of come back to the last question, can be very common in both ADHD and autism. And unplanned changes are really difficult because they do happen, and there's no getting away from the fact that they do happen. And lots of stuff that you're probably already doing is just trying to stick to routines where we can, given as much advance notice as possible of unplanned changes and so on, or given not unplanned changes, any planned changes, given as much advance notice as possible. Sometimes with some children, when I'm kind of putting a plan and a routine in place, I'll try and do like a bit of a if and then approach. So I'll say, right, this is the plan, but if this happens, then we're going to do this instead, and trying to preempt the alternative. But for some children, that would absolutely not work, and they might become very fixated on the alternative, and that might be the case for your son as well. So just something that, again, works for some people, not everyone. Would also say, when you're talking to him about that, I think it's the goal really is to try and help him, and you know, sometimes it takes a lifetime for people to get there, but to try and help him to try and understand that we're going to do everything we can to keep that structure and routine that you like. There are going to be unplanned changes, so instead of maybe preempting what the change could be, how are we going to deal with it if something does change? And know it makes you really upset, and validate those feelings and know how it makes you feel. If something does change, how are we going to deal with it? So instead of getting angry, how can we try and manage that anger? And I would relate it back to a lot of the emotional regulation stuff that we've spoken about. So talk to him about where in his body does he feel that emotion when a plan does change. What does it feel like for him? And talking about, well, next time a plan does change, we're going to try everything we can to stop it changing. What can we do to try and calm ourselves down instead of becoming really out of control and really angry? How can we do that? Is it breathing exercises? Is it distraction techniques, grounding techniques? And I'd explore a few of those things on the slides with him. So we're not necessarily preempting by saying, well, if the plan changes, then we're going to do this instead, if that's going to upset him. But we're saying, this is the plan. We know plans can change. what are we going to do if the plan does change? Hopefully it's not going to, but if the plan is going to change, what's our plan then? How can we calm ourselves down and try and stay calm about it, and having almost a plan in place for managing our emotions for when we do have those unplanned changes. But I would say a lot of the slides that you'll receive there on emotional regulation will help, and then there's a few other bits and links and things that I've put on the slide around flexible thinking that can hopefully help with some more ideas around that as well.
Brilliant, thanks Arron. And yeah, like I said, we haven't really got any more time for any questions, and we've had so many through. It's been a really popular webinar, so I'm so sorry that we haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, but